Hi, I'm James Jackson, and welcome to the very first episode of Mad in Germany, a podcast exposing German psychodrama to the world. For this episode, I was joined by Deborah Feldman, author of Unorthodox and Judenfetisch. We had a really interesting conversation that lasted for over 2 hours. So I'm going to split this episode into 2 parts and publish the next bit very soon. It took a bit longer to get out there than I expected, and there are a few teething problems, so I'm going to ask for your patience while we smooth out for next time. Without further ado, enjoy the show and stay mad. So, welcome, Deborah.
Thank you. And this is Paco. He's my dog. He's kind of the star of the show.
Yeah, special guest, Paco. So why don't you tell me what this has been like for you the last 6 months plus in Germany since October the 7th, when a lot of people have noticed that there's been a bit of a change in the public discourse, a sort of hardening into a pro-Israel camp, and then also on the other side, pro-Palestine camp, often made up of migrants. Did this surprise you, the strength of the feeling on this issue?
So definitely the last 7 months have been a roller coaster emotionally. No, there was no surprise. One of the first things I did in the week after October 7 was publish a small commentary in the Spiegel, in which I expressed my fear that the images of brutalized women would not be used to save the women imprisoned as hostages, but be used to justify violence against other women and children. And the reason why I could say that within a few days of October 7th is because I had been looking very closely at the changes in Israeli society for many years, out of a concern born of my own particular experience with radical fundamentalism and observing the rise of fundamentalism in Israel. And one of the things that I focused on when I was writing the book Judenfetisch was this prediction that I had that the rise of right-wing extremist positioning in Israel would force countries that had traditionally allied themselves with Israel to, in a sense, accompany the rise of these positions with mirrored transformations in their own societies. By which I mean the alliance would be considered so holy and untouchable that these countries would see no option other than to join Israel on its journey towards radicalization as a result of loyalty to this alliance. And I believed at the time that I was writing the book that we would see this in a decade or so. And so I think what has been surprising to me about the past 7 months is how quickly this prediction seemed to come true and how powerless we seem to be at understanding this transformation, at resisting it, and at imagining the consequences that will affect all of us very quickly down the road.
But what does that look like in practice in Germany? What are you referring to?
Okay, so what I'm referring to is the fact that the Staatsräson is built into the power dynamic in Germany. So that means that in Germany, if you want to have discursive or political power, you can instrumentalize the issue to become influential in discourse or to become politically relevant.
By the Staatsräson, you mean Germany's loyalty to Israel, sort of an unwritten constitutional clause that isn't actually in the constitution.
Yeah, but it's a rhetorical tool. So I've watched people who have very right-wing views instrumentalize this tool to center themselves in the discourse, within the mainstream discourse, and to exercise influence over political decisions by using this tool. So I'm speaking about people who would otherwise have no voice in mainstream discourse and they would have no influence in politics, but by using this issue, they're able to, in a sense, find the weakness, to find the back door with which they can then in a sense, infect or contaminate the German political discourse.
You're talking about effectively grifters, but can I ask you who you mean specifically?
So I actually, I want to be very careful here, and I want to divide into various categories, because I'm somebody who actually maintains strong relationships with people from all parts of the political spectrum, because I think it's my responsibility to do that as somebody who observes and thinks and contributes to discourse. And so I'll be, for example, in conversation with conservatives who have quite hardline positions on this issue, but they really do believe that they're coming from a place of good intention. So they really do feel deeply that they have this very German responsibility to have this unquestioning loyalty to Israel that no one else will ever have because the rest of the world is anti-Semitic, and so on and so forth. And these are the people I'll remain in conversation with, because I feel that little by little I can open their minds somewhat, I can broaden their horizon somewhat, and at the same time they give me the gift of understanding why they think the way they think. But then there are these other categories. For example, there are the people who are really loud in public about anti-Semitism. It's the only thing they talk about. It's basically what they're known for, becomes their brand. But when you confront these people in private, or when they confront you, I put it that way, and they know that no one is listening to what they're saying, what they have revealed to me is that they don't have good intentions, and they don't need to believe that they have good intentions. They're very cynical. They figured out that this is now a tool of power, and they really experience a sense of morbid vindication that they can now use the tool of history, of German history, against Jews in a way that makes me think these people are actually bullies who've now figured out that they can get away with bullying as long as they use these rhetorical tools.
And would you say it's anti-Semitic bullying if their targets are so often or disproportionately Jews?
I experience these people as anti-Semites because what they express to me privately is that they experience special joy in being able to finally attack a Jewish person while being able to claim legitimacy for attacking that Jewish person. So there's this sort of really special satisfaction that they feel like, finally we got our rights back. Finally, we as Germans can legitimately attack Jews again, because now we've been given the rhetorical tools to do so, and we cannot be touched for this. This makes us untouchable. And it's true. Anybody who implements pro-Israel rhetoric in Germany becomes holy, becomes unantastbar, as they say.
Untouchable, yes.
Yeah.
I think I have noticed personally from doing a lot of reporting on this issue, the way that some figures who are pro-Israel attack the Jüdische Stimme in particular, who are a leftist anti-Zionist group who have been very prominent and in the last few months, and were also involved in the Palestina Congress, when they list the anti-Semitic contacts of various groups and reasons why it should be cancelled, I've noticed sometimes the first few people they list are Jews. So we have this situation of loud political Germans listing Jews as a reason, contact with Jews, problematic ones, allegedly problematic ones, because of their anti-Zionism, as a reason to cancel other people. So it's kind of a strange reversal of the Kontaktschuld, where actually being with the wrong type of Jews makes you guilty of anti-Semitism. And would you say Germany has taken a side in this dispute between nationalist or Zionist Jews and non-Zionist Jews?
Well, Germany took a side already in the 50s, right? Germany took a side when Adenauer said, the path to achieving acceptance in the world again is going to be to walk alongside Israel to the death, right? To prove that we are now worthy of being seen as part of the international community and being, in a sense, forgiven for our crimes.
This is Konrad Adenauer.
Konrad Adenauer. And so
founding father of the CDU.
Konrad Adenauer was the founding father of the CDU. He was the first chancellor of Germany, and he was very open about his cynical stance on the issue, right? I mean, he said, we must not underestimate the power of the Jews. He felt that, in a sense, Germany had failed to dismantle this power, and therefore Germany now had to submit to this power. It was like, we lost the game, now we have to play it their way. And
the way I think he said that in the 60s in a television interview. Yes, and the way he said it was quite interesting. He said, auch noch heute, even today, the Jews are very powerful.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so, the relationship between Germany and Israel was founded on tremendous cynicism, and it was also what led to the biggest protest movement in Israel in the history of the country, because most Jews in Israel were horrified by this cynicism. But Israel had no choice, because economically it was facing ruin. It was facing ruin. Without the agreement with Adenauer, they would not have been able to continue existing. And Germany knew this very well, and Germany profited more from this agreement than Israel did. But what I'm trying to say is that Germany chose sides early on between the Zionist Jew and the diaspora Jew. Germany chose sides between Zionists and Holocaust survivors. I mean, one of the ironies about the Luxembourg Agreement was how many Holocaust survivors died in poverty and neglect because the money went to Israel and not to Holocaust survivors, right? So
I thought some Holocaust survivors got direct payments.
Some did, but many were sort of thrown under the bus because Israel needed the money for the project of the state, and there wasn't enough money for Israel and all of the Holocaust survivors. There are stories. I went to a conference a couple of years back that was commemorating the agreement, and there was a woman there who spoke about her mother having written these desperate letters to the German government her whole life, trying to get compensation, and having died without compensation in terrible conditions. And it's the tragedy of this agreement was that it was prioritizing the building of a state in relation to the compensation for actual victims. Some victims were compensated, yes, but the prioritization was building the Israeli state. So if you look at this relationship, early on you see that Germany tries to, in a sense, wash its hands of any other responsibility by focusing on this responsibility toward Israel, because it's also easier. It makes things simpler. We just support Israel and we're good. We're good to go. We're done.
Get out of jail free card effectively.
Exactly. And that pattern has just been firmly established, and that worked for the longest time, because most Jews also didn't even have a problem with the fact that Israel was representing Judaism to Germany, and that Germany's loyalty to Israel was a way of repairing its historical wrongs. I think the problem started to occur when Netanyahu was first elected. I think that we're looking, in a sense, at the last 2-3 decades, where you see this transformation in Israel, where Israel radicalizes, and where the peace process fails miserably and is dissolved in violence. And Germany doubles down and says, exactly now, when we should be working towards the peace that the Oslo Accords promised, exactly now, we will remain closely at Israel's side. We will even create culturally impactful language like the word Staatsräson that will,
which means the existent reason of state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, and this really cemented the relationship and its tone culturally and politically. And it became, as a result, a tool of rhetorical power. And so when you say that in Germany right now, there's this idea of the wrong kind of Jew, and look, I mean, the Jüdische Stimme is not a big fan of me. I'm not radical enough for them, even though I respect everyone's right to protest, and I will fight for everyone's freedom to protest. I'm not radical enough for most, and yet probably because I'm not radical enough for most, I'm possibly the most hated Jew in Germany, because I refuse, in a sense, to fit into people's neat categories of good Jew or bad Jew.
Well, I guess you grew up in a, as you described it, fundamentalist, extremist kind of environment, and one of the ways you escaped that was by being very critical. And so then you came to Germany, and maybe you've remained critical both of Germany and of the some of the Jewish groups here, both on the left and the right, or establishment, anti-establishment?
Well, the publication of Unorthodox in 2012 caused quite a stir. It was, at the time, very much about speaking truth to power. Maybe it was a small power, but it was power nonetheless and had never been spoken to. And I wasn't applauded back then. I mean, even the secular and the liberal Jewish community in the U.S. was very nervous about the book at the time. They felt that even though I had a right to leave and I had a right to feel the way that I felt, they were nervous about, bringing this issue into the public sphere. And now, this issue is completely mainstream. And, Netflix also put it on the world map and everything's fine. But already back then, I developed a sense of self that was built around this idea that I am only me if I am free, and I am only free if I can speak truth to power. But at the same time, because the power I was speaking truth to was small, and because it didn't really threaten the actual power structures, I didn't become something of a mascot toward the end. I mean, especially in Germany, especially once the Netflix series was released, I really was everybody's favorite little Jewish runaway. Like, oh, the little girl that ran away to Berlin. And I mean, of course, there was backlash from the conservative Jewish community precisely about that. They felt there was something suspicious about the way Germans loved me. So I thought I would do them a favor and show them that Germans don't love me after all. But there was a sense in which I realized that by becoming this mascot, I was no longer the me that was speaking truth to power. I was the me that was confirming power. And to be more precise, there is this Jewish newspaper in Germany that is funded by the Central Council of Jews.
The Jüdische
Allgemeine. And the Central Council of Jews is funded by the German government to the tune of 22 million euros a year as a base financing. And the Central Council of Jews, however, only represents less than half of the Jews living in Germany and is losing members rapidly by the year.
Why is that? And why does it only represent half of the Jews in Germany? Do you mean only less than half of the Jews are part of religious communities that are associated?
Actually, no. I mean, most Jews in Germany aren't really religious, but the Central Council of Jews was born during the time that Adenauer made the agreement with Ben-Gurion. And it was because Ben-Gurion basically said to him, you need to have some kind of representation of our interests in your government, in your country. And Konrad Adenauer first suggested to have a Referat für jüdische Angelegenheiten, so a kind of, what would you call that in English? Like
a lecturer for Jewish opportunities?
A Referat is more somebody like who's responsible for Jewish issues, like a kind of person, a commissioner in the government. And the Jewish community at the time, which was largely comprised of Holocaust survivors, they rebelled against this idea vehemently because they said it reminded them of the Judenräte, the Jewish councils that the Nazis set up during World War II to make the genocide go more efficiently.
Who Hannah Arendt was very critical of in Icahn in Jerusalem,
I mean, it really was a very special form of cruelty that the Nazis were very good at getting Jews to be agents of their own destruction. And this had left a very traumatic impact on the Jewish community. And they said, we will never trust any advocate of our interests if it is part of your power system. And so Adenauer, seeing the rationale, offered the Jewish community complete autonomy and said, you can form your own council and I will fund your council and I will never have any say in what your council does with the funding I'm giving you. He gave them complete autonomy for understandable reasons. And as a result, there was enormous backlash from Israel because Israel said, how dare you legitimize another Jewish representational voice? Besides Israel, we are the only legitimate representation of world Jewry. Don't speak to anyone else but us. And I believe that it was at the Zionist Congress after the war where some members argued that the German Jewish community should have its voice disqualified in the Congress because they had chosen to stay in a country that had perpetrated the Holocaust and so on. And so for a long time, the Zentralrat der Juden was actually very isolated. And I think this was very painful for them. And as a result, they worked really hard to, in a sense, earn the approval of Israel and to be accepted back into the fold by saying, look, we're here representing your interests. yes, we are a Jewish community, but our number one loyalty is to you, and we will be here for you. That was sort of the deal. And so the Zentralrat has historically and traditionally understood itself as a partner for Israel in Germany. And that was okay for a long time. And when the Soviet Jews came in two waves, one wave before the wall was built and one wave after the wall fell, the Zentralrat was responsible for incorporating these Jews. Many of them had to be converted because they were only considered Jewish through the patrilineal line, because that's how the Soviet Union defined Jews, through the father. And when they arrived, they were not technically halachically Jewish, not Jewish according to Jewish law. They knew nothing about Judaism, so they needed to be taught, they needed to be converted. The Zentralrat had a really difficult time with this. I think that they must have... I think they rose to the occasion as best as they could. I don't want to judge them for this, but they also transmitted their values to these people. And since these people didn't have any other Jewish values at the time, they were happy to absorb them. And for a long time, that was fine. And what changed was, in the last 2 to 3 decades, Jews from all over the world came to Germany.
Including many left-wing Israelis, of course.
Of course.
And Americans.
Absolutely. The left-wing Americans, the left-wing Israelis, I don't want to deny that. We're a big part of what happened. But also you have to understand that Germany was an open and exciting place to live after the wall fell. And a lot of Jewish people living all over the world were able to get German passports based on what had happened to their ancestors. And so there was just an influx for all kinds of personal, private, political, social reasons. Jews started coming to Germany. And they did not join the Zentralrat der Juden because they came from such a vastly different Jewish culture that they didn't feel at home. And the Zentralrat didn't make an effort to create a home for them because the Zentralrat understandably felt threatened by the fact that their version of Jewishness was so different as to destabilize all of the claims they had until that point made about Jewishness in Germany.
But was it their Jewishness that was threatened, or was it their Germanness?
Well, I guess you could say their German Jewishness, right? The German version of Jewishness is really very unique, and it's something they'll be the first to admit that it's as a result of these really unique circumstances, the version of Jewishness you experience in Germany is really one of a kind. And, when the Americans come here and the Israelis come here, they look, they're a bit shocked, and they're like, okay, we'll do our own thing. We don't need them because obviously we don't need them. We're fine. They're coming mostly from positions of privilege. We're expats. We can form our own unofficial communities. The problem is not the resources that the Zentralrat gets, not the 22 million a year they get to fund all of their projects and so on. We can do fine without that. But as a result of them being officially recognized as representatives of the Jews in Germany, they have a claim to a representative voice that is very prominently featured in all media discourse, in all of the political decision-making, and yet they are representing a minority of Jews.
They have that fault, as you would say in German.
Yeah, and they really do have access to, within their closed little system, quite a lot of power. Now, for example, there would be a council of Jews that would represent American Jews, left-wing Israeli Jews, Jews from France, Jews from Switzerland, Jews from England, Jews from Scandinavia, whatever.
Or the former Soviet Union as well.
Yes. So what would happen would be that then the Jewish community would be a politically diverse community, would be a pluralist community with many perspectives. And then when the Zentralrat would be asked to represent their community in any given conversation, they wouldn't really be able to give one bottom line, right? Because the political spectrum wouldn't be too diverse. And so as a result, they've kind of insisted on being one point on the political spectrum and squeezing everyone else out. And this is the way that they can dominate the discourse around Jews in Israel. There has been some resistance to that. The resistance, of course, threatens this pattern, this behavior, because either what will happen is either they will have to give some of their representational rights away, or they will have to make room for other views. Neither of those things are very desirable. And so what they're doing is they're mirroring the Israeli method of saying, these are the good Jews, and these are the enemies of the good Jews, the bad Jews.
But of course, the Centrala don't just talk about Israel issues. I mean, it was actually the Centralrat that recently decided or told the German government not to remove the word Hassa, race, from the constitution. And then I think I saw the other day, the leader of the Centralrat, Schuster, said that left-wingers have anti-Semitism in their DNA. So it's quite a strange, and I think he meant it literally, like this idea that some things were transmitted by DNA, which is, quite a controversial topic in a country that's usually very critical of the idea of race at all.
So one of the main theses of my book, Judenfetisch, is that if you as a Jewish person don't have a lot of input in your own life about what it is, what it means to be Jewish, you basically have no alternative but to absorb the subliminal ideas of Jewishness that you get from mainstream popular culture. And one of the subliminal ideas in German mainstream popular culture about Jews is that there is something at their very genetic core that makes them different. And this view has never really been overcome. And because so many Jewish people in Germany don't have a real homegrown tradition, they don't have a truly innate, intrinsic sense of Jewishness that has been given to them by their families and through lived experience, they, in a sense, interpret Jewishness based on what they are given as impulses and ideas by German society.
And would you say German society is still anti-Semitic?
Yes, I experienced German society as deeply anti-Semitic. One of the things that really shocked me recently was when Chancellor Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, he did a little speech on freedom of the press, and he used a word. Yeah, it's a terrible word. It's one of the most deeply anti-Semitic words in existence. It's a big part of the history of anti-Semitism, and it's a word that has been discussed extensively in the media for 15 years. I mean, it is impossible to have been a person in Germany in the last 15 years who reads newspapers and who takes part in any kind of political or media culture and not know that the word Mauscheln stands for anti-Semitism, for the history of European and above all of German anti-Semitism. I think one of the first things that is important to know when you're considering the Chancellor's address on the freedom of the press is that in using a word like Mauscheln, before we talk about its anti-Semitic implications, it's important to know that Mauscheln isn't actually a word that's part of statesman-like German vocabulary. Mauscheln is a colloquialism. It's used very much as a kind of slang. It's not appropriate language for this format, regardless of its implications. So it's quite odd.
And it comes from the word for Moses, right?
It comes from the Jewish name Moses or Moshe. And
what does it mean?
It means, so in German, it means to cheat, to swindle, to perform criminal business transactions. And the reason that it means that way is I actually discovered the word in a really good book by the Austro-Hungarian author Gregor von Rhetoric, who wrote a really famous text that was translated into English under the title Memoirs of an Anti-Semite, in which he really explains anti-Semitism, the deep roots of it. And his character uses this word to refer to the way that Jews would speak to each other in their own language that Germans would not understand. And so when they were Mauscheln, speaking like Moshe, speaking like Jews, in a sense they were swindling. And so Mauschelei or Mauscheln became a German word that was generally for unclean business, for.
But it actually referred to people speaking Yiddish.
It referred to people speaking Yiddish from an anti-Semitic perspective of the only reason they could have to speak Yiddish was not to maintain their own cultural identity, but to cheat those who don't understand the language.
So it's quite clearly an anti-Semitic word. Why do you think the Chancellor did this?
So I don't understand it really, because I mean, the chancellor has all these people working for him and all these people preparing his speeches and his social media work. And I mean, there are all of these basic books that have been published in the German language, which explain, which anti-Semitic words are no longer appropriate. It's not like the people working for him would not have had multiple opportunities to learn about this and to have access to these kinds of books. So
was he actually criticized for using it?
I'm the only one. So this is the fascinating part. So there is somebody in this country, a journalist, a Jewish journalist, very prominent, who's usually at the front lines with issues like this. He's even written a book about the anti-Semitic words in the German language, and he was featured in all the newspapers talking about this word, Mauscheln, many, many times.
You mean Ronen Steinke?
Ronen Steinke. But Ronen Steinke was silent.
So I just want to come back to the anti-Semitism commissioners, because they're quite interesting. For people who aren't aware, Germany has 16 anti-Semitism commissioners. There's the national one, Felix Stein, as well as every state except, I believe, Bremen has their own one. But a lot of them are not necessarily very informed about Jewish life, and some of them are actually have quite strange views about Jews. I'm thinking of an article in Jewish Currents where it talked about Michael Blume, who said that the Jewish knowledge had kind of filtered down to the schools in Baden-Württemberg, where he's the anti-Semitism commissioner of. And then also there is the case in Hamburg of a commissioner who has implied that he's converted to Judaism, which sort of goes against the point. So none of these people are Jewish. What's the kind of the logic behind the anti-Semitism commissioners, and why didn't they come to your defense when you experienced, violent rape fantasies?
Mm-hmm. So the logic behind the anti-Semitism commissioners' embrace of Judaism to the point where they seem to want to embody Jewishness and also represent Jewishness and define Jewishness. This traces back to the title of my book, the Judenfetisch, so the Jewish fetish, which primarily expresses itself in Germany through Jew-facing. There is like a really old trend that goes back to directly after the Second World War of Germans who become so obsessed with the figure of the Jew and what it will forever mean for German identity, that they embody the Jew, that they embody the ideas they have of the Jew, and they perform these ideas. And these ideas are often very German, and they are often deeply influenced by anti-Semitism.
So it's German philo-Semitism with an anti-Semitic twist.
Well, philo-Semitism is anti-Semitism, right? It's the other side of the coin, but it basically doesn't allow the object of its love or its hatred to be a human being, to be an individual, right? It dissolves the object of affection or hatred into a projection. And if we as Jews don't submit to this projection, we are then the enemy that must be eliminated. We are disturbing this romantic, fetishizing relationship between Germany and its beloved Jews, its beloved projection of Jews. There's a really interesting case with the Anti-Semitism Commissioner Felix Klein, who I recently called out on Twitter for having claimed in the past that he was a German Jew. He's not a German Jew, and he grew up evangelical Christian, and his relationship to Judaism is also very much defined by Christian messianism. But what's fascinating about him is not so much the Jew facing, but the way he seems to use his role as somebody who's there to police anti-Semitism in a sense, in a way that seems to help the far right. And I will go into a concrete example. Hans-Georg Maaßen, who was head of the German Verfassungsschutz, how would you translate?
The Office for Constitutional Protection. It's the internal domestic intelligence service of Germany.
A really important office, because the office is there in a sense to protect the soul of German democracy, to protect the integrity of this country's constitutional values. Really important office. Hans-Georg Maaßen who now is canceled, so to speak, right? He's been canceled because he has right-wing extremist views.
He spread conspiracy theories that there were no hunting of foreigners in a neo-Nazi riot in Chemnitz a few years ago.
And he also spread conspiracy theories that had these sort of anti-Semitic wolf whistles in them about globalists and cosmopolitans and so on. And a young German activist named Luise Neubauer called him out on this on German TV and said, Hans-Georg Maaßen, a man who is in charge of protecting the soul of our country's democracy, is going around spreading the most primitive, most original anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have ever existed. And this is just, and nobody's objecting. And she called him an anti-Semite. And you know what Felix Klein, the anti-Semitism commissioner, did? He scolded her. He scolded her and corrected her. And when Jewish Currents confronted him about this, he said, the next time he runs into Luise Neubauer, he hopes to apologize. But as far as I know from Luise Neubauer, this never happened. And this, to me, is a really good example of how the anti-Semitism commissioners see themselves in the political service of an agenda. And they've fully understood the power vested in their office, and they're fully determined to use it to further that agenda.
But what is that agenda? If it's not stopping anti-Semitism and promoting Jewish life, what is it in your view?
I believe the agenda is promoting the maintenance of power structures that keep systems of privilege as they've existed in Germany until now in place.
And those are systems which privilege ethnic Germans, non-Jewish Germans.
Well, they certainly privilege Germans who claim to be anti-Semitism commissioners. They certainly privilege Germans who claim to be...
Although they're unpaid positions, aren't they? Some of them, not the Felix.
The positions themselves may be unpaid, but they lead to avenues of influence, and they lead to networks of political and medial power that are very useful also in a transactional sense. And they're really useful also in the sense that people who are appointed to be anti-Semitism commissioners aren't appointed according to any sort of system of rules and regulations, as the Jewish Currents pointed out. It's basically an arbitrary appointment.
Yeah, it's very ad hoc.
Yeah, and it's friends of friends. It's people will choose their friends because they say these friends will be loyal to them because they understand that it's a position that comes with a lot of power, and if they put a friend in that position, then in a sense they will always be protected by the power of anti-Semitism. And as I mentioned earlier, it is, as a rhetorical tool, extremely powerful. It has the ability to start media shitstorms. It has the ability to lead people to be fired, to lead people to be pushed out of the discourse. So it makes total sense that everyone should want to have a piece of that power. And the way that you create a piece of that power is you create a position where it says this person is responsible for anti-Semitism, and therefore this person must always be listened to. This person must always be invited to everything. This person must always have a say.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, the disjoint between, in some cases, how influential these commissioners are and like how little democratic oversight is of them, and also how little expertise many of them have for Jewish life. I mean, Michael Blum was previously praised for knowing a bit more, despite his slightly unorthodox views.
Michael Blum has no problem with the fact that somebody wished that I was a hostage in Gaza.
Michael Blum also praised a rather notorious speech by a British right-wing, arguably far-right, Douglas Murray, commentator, who said at least the Nazis felt shamed about what they did, which is just, that's actually arguably Holocaust revisionism, because many of them didn't feel ashamed.
It's what in German they call Verharmlosung des Holocaust.
Yeah, minimization of the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's like the reduction or the making it appear harmless or less harmful than it was, and it's something that is very rampant in Germany. And we had a really big scandal with a politician in Bavaria named Aiwanger.
Yes, the deputy minister of Bavaria.
Yeah, he had this, apparently when he was in school, he wrote this pamphlet.
Although his brother actually claimed that he wrote it.
Yeah. So my point
Thanks for
is
the
that
scan.
there's a long tradition in Germany of minimizing the Holocaust, and Michael Blume was not the only one to share these clips from Douglas Murray. Also, a lot of other politicians.
Karl Lauterbach. What do you think about this idea of German guilt? Do you think Germans do feel guilty for the Holocaust?
I think that everyday Germans, just, your regular Joe, the kind of person you'll meet in a cafe or in a doctor's waiting room, I would say that the people that I meet there feel very deeply moved by the weight of history, feel very intimidated by this weight. They often feel that they are not entitled to have a view on anything, that they're not entitled to have a voice because of this weight. And they often feel like they can't trust their own perspective on the world because of it. So they might, for example, privately say that they don't feel that the indiscriminate violence in Gaza is okay, but they won't say it publicly because they feel that they can't trust their own instincts, because the politics in this country are so pro-Israel and are so good at using the Holocaust as a way to legitimize that anyone who feels moved by the history of the Holocaust will think twice before expressing an opinion.
And I think it's interesting because internationally, Germany, at the UN has been voting abstentions on ceasefire votes. So it's something, the pro-Israel side is something you see more domestically than internationally, although of course there was a lot of weapons given to Israel by Germany, and then getting involved in South Africa's case of genocide case against Israel at The Hague.
Okay, so I actually believe that Germany's political approach to Israel is probably always going to just mirror the American approach, because generally German politics tends to be in lockstep behind American politics.
True with Ukraine as well.
Exactly. So I'm just going to posit that anything Germany is actually doing on the political floor in terms of sending weapons, in terms of political support, that has nothing to do with the Staatsräson. That's just politics. And German politics is basically an extension of American politics for understandable reasons, for understandable historical reasons. However, my argument about the Staatsräson has actually nothing to do with German political actions. My argument about the Staatsräson has to do with the actual political internal makeup of Germany. So what does Germany's political future look like? Who are going to be the future holders of power? Who are going to be the future oppressed minorities? Who is going to have to be afraid in this country? And who is going to feel like they're untouchable in this country? And that is what Staatsräson is really about. It's a Kulturkampf, a culture war between the ones who are grasping at power and the ones who know that they are losing the little power they ever had.
So one thing I've observed since October the 7th is that many cultural institutions have become increasingly white and ethnic German because for whatever reason, perhaps it is this guilt, perhaps it is something more cynical, white ethnic Germans have been less likely to offer any kind of criticism of Israel. I mean, probably also some sincere being moved by this view of Jews under attack, this horrific massacre by Hamas. So actually, we've seen Germany, in a sense, in terms of representation and diversity, take quite a few steps backwards in terms of moderators, artists who were getting public funds, which are very important here. There's been very few cancellations of white ethnic Germans and quite a lot of cancellations of Jews, of Israeli Jews as well, and of course, even more so of Muslims and people with a Muslim background. People of color,
yeah.
Including Black British writers.
So this is a clear sort of evidence of the culture war I'm speaking of, the culture war between white Germany and non-white Germany, which we know has been going on since Angela Merkel opened the doors and said, "Wir schaffen das, we'll manage this." There has been a culture war in this country between this idea of Germany is German, Deutschland in Deutsch, And Germany is a pluralistic country with room for multiple cultures and multiple ethnic and religious and other identities. And so what has happened is that in the guise of anti-Semitism, the culture war has been wrestled to an extent that the far right has been able to successfully use these rhetorical tools introduced by the escalation in the Middle East conflict to throw the odds in their favor. And to jump into that a little bit more specifically, I've been understandably attacked because of my work and my theses and the statements I give in interviews. But I've been very amused to see, for example, German academics say exactly the same things and be positively received, really positively received. And the implication there is, we get to say these things, but you don't. You have to perform the part that we've given you.
Which is the grateful immigrant, perhaps?
No, which is the Jew as projection, the Jew as a fulfilled expectation, a fulfilled anti-Semitic expectation. And as soon as we become individual, as soon as we become human, as soon as we exist beyond the very narrow boundaries of Jewishness that Germans have erected for us, we are a threat and we must be eliminated. And so I've watched people rise in the discourse by saying the things I say, while other people with different skin color or with different ethnic heritage or different identities will be, in a sense, sidelined or marginalized for saying those things. And I'm a really interesting case. I think I'm a little bit of an exception here, something which I've emphasized from the beginning when I talk about marginalization is it's difficult to marginalize me. It's difficult because I was extremely well known before I published this book. And I was really a big part of popular culture.
Unorthodox, of course, international smash on Netflix.
Yeah, and I think the book in the German language broke the record for sales in its category here.
Wow.
And so it's really hard to marginalize someone like that. I think what has happened instead is that efforts have been made to destabilize the relationship that my audience has with me. And so, very in the beginning, I spoke a little bit about the Central Council of Jews and how they have this newspaper that they fund with the money they get from the government. And the newspaper represents the party line of the Central Council, which is, conservative until right wing. And one of the things they did was that, they published a lot of attacks on me when my book was published. And they, continuously published attacks as I became more and more outspoken on the issue of Israel-Palestine. And one of the most interesting articles I found was an article where they said, oh, what happened to Deborah? She used to be this highly respected and respectable author, and we are watching in real time as she radicalizes herself. And I thought this was fascinating because on the one hand, it was the first time in the history of their coverage on me where they were saying that I was respected and respectable. In a sense, they were trying to say, no, she was different in the past because radicalization can only be proven if one can show a process of transformation. So they had to kind of rewrite their own version of history by saying, we respected her before, but now we don't, whereas actually they never respected me. They published all kinds of attacks on me, even with Unorthodox, because I just didn't fit the public idea of Jewishness that they wanted to promote. But what I found even more interesting was they said I'm radicalizing. I thought, if I'm radicalizing, what are the radicals doing? But then I realized that they're right. Because of course I've gone through a process of transformation. I've gone through a process of transformation in the last 15 years, and I've gone through a process of transformation in the last 6 months. But the reason why that process of transformation can be described as radical is not because the transformation is. If we define radical as something that is in opposition to the status quo, then we need to talk about the fact that the status quo has changed dramatically as well. And the line of the Jewish newspaper, which also changed when the new editor came on board, has become, in its own way, radical. It has become a newspaper that can print an article saying there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. It's a newspaper that will employ a journalist.
Tobias Koch that wrote that one, right?
And it's a newspaper that will employ the journalist that is allowed to fantasize in public about my hostage taking. And so in a sense, they were right. They were saying that I was in opposition to a status quo that they had only recently established for themselves. And if the status quo moves so far away in such a short space of time, even people who go through small transformations can legitimately be described as having radicalized. We were discussing categories of people at the beginning of this conversation, and I talked about conservatives who have a hardline position because they believe they come from a place of good intention, and I talked about conservatives who are quite cynical and actually enjoy the fact that this is now an opportunity for them to exercise power. But I also believe that there are people who are very simply stuck in a system of thinking within which I was also stuck for a long time. And it's a very defensive way of thinking.
What do you mean specifically by that?
So this is where we get to the ugly part, because I was raised by Holocaust survivors. I was raised with their trauma and their view of the world as a world that is innately anti-Semitic and cannot be changed. And I was raised to believe that if it's a fight for our safety, then it doesn't matter what the cost is, because no one else is going to fight for us. So I was really raised with this trauma. And so when I left the community, I left many aspects of the ideology behind me, but I didn't leave the Holocaust trauma behind me. And I remember when I first came to Germany, I remember walking through the streets and trying to sort of imagine what the people that I was meeting, what they would have been like in 1939. Like, I would imagine them in their positions, in their circumstances in society, and I would imagine, like, would they be somebody who denounces a Jew? Would they be somebody who would join the Nazi party? Would they be somebody who joined the resistance? I was always trying to, like, orient people in those categories. I will say one thing. I will say that the last 6 months have given me a lot of clarity when I play that game. I now know immediately where I can sort of allocate people. But that's also a way of saying that it's still happening in my mind. I'm still looking at the world through the eyes of my grandparents and wondering which one of the people I meet will be happy to send me to the concentration camps, right? That's just what trauma is. And it's the kind of trauma that we're giving to the Palestinians right now. So, okay, so considering that, and considering I was raised to believe that everyone hates Jews, and I was raised to believe that it's us against the world and it's us against other minorities, and we have to fight for our right to live regardless of the price that we have to pay. When I first moved here, a lot of people told me, oh, be very careful about anti-Semitism. And I was like, what do you mean? Are the Germans still anti-Semites? And they were like, no, the Arabs, because I was living in Neukölln. And everyone was telling me, you have to be really careful. Don't tell anyone you're Jewish. Tell your son not to tell anyone he's Jewish. I believed it. Why should I not believe it? I was raised to believe it. I had never experienced anything that had disproven this worldview to me. So when other Jewish people said to me, be careful of the Arabs, I was careful of the Arabs. And I remember the first thing that happened when I moved to Germany was I went to a Vodafone shop, or was it a telecom shop? I don't know, a phone shop on Hermannplatz to get like a phone. And yeah, I had to give my passport. I had an American passport at the time. And the guy who took the passport looked at the passport, and he looked at me and he's like, you're Jewish? And I was like, oh my God, it's happening. And I was like, yes, is that okay? And he was like, yeah, but I don't like what Israel's doing to the Palestinians. And I was like, I'm not Israeli. And he was like, no, I know. And it was like, conversation over. And I was like, oh my God, I just experienced my first anti-Semitic incident. I was like in panic. Like, I left the shop and I called everybody I knew. I was like, I experienced Arab anti-Semitism. And it was years before I realized that what was happening in that moment was a person looking at me and saying to himself, she's Jewish, but she's not responsible for what the Israeli government is doing to Palestinians in the West Bank. He was going through his own process. Like, he was being confronted with this situation where he could have said, she's Jewish, therefore I will equate her with what Israel's doing, and he didn't. But just experiencing him going through that process with me, I was already so triggered and so sensitive that I was convinced that I had just experienced anti-Semitism.
I mean, arguably, it was anti-Semitic to, just because you're Jewish to even bring up Israel, right?
You know, at that point, I was already accustomed to it because Germans did that all the time. So I felt in a way that when he was bringing up Israel as a result of my admitting that I was Jewish, that he was in a sense doing something very German. I didn't see that as because what I had been warned was that Arabs will hold me accountable for Israel's behavior. They will equate me with Israel. You know, Germans were doing that anyway. But I remember that it took me years to put that episode into context. And so, you know, when I first would give interviews about anti-Semitism, I would tell the newspapers like, oh yeah, the Arabs, they hate Jews. And like I would, because I had been told this and I believed it and I repeated it. And so in many ways, like I was a vessel for the trauma-based racism of other people and I passed it on. And you know when I stopped passing it on? When I was confronted with an experience that disproved it. So what happened? I started meeting more and more Arabs. I started meeting more and more Palestinians. It was 2015. All these refugees were coming in from Syria. We were sitting in these cafes, having conversations about philosophy and politics with people who spoke fluent English. And all of a sudden I was like, wait a second, what I'm experiencing right now is not jiving with the worldview I was raised to have. And it's not jiving with the worldview that people told me I should have. And it was a slow process since then. And because of that, it's not like right now I can say to you that I am enlightened, that I have learned all there is to learn and I know the truth and I know which side I'm on. But I will say that like many progressive Jews are doing at this moment in time all over the world, I have decided that it is time to learn. And therefore, I am listening really closely to all sides of the conversation. I really am. And I am trying really hard to take responsibility for the small amount of privilege I do have and to use that responsibility wisely. And for many people, that's not enough. And I accept that. It might not be enough right now. But I will say to them, I am in a process of transformation. I am, as the Jüdische Allgemeine accuses me, radicalizing in a sense that I am trying to hold on to humanitarian values as the status quo is slipping ever farther away from them. My radicalization consists of clinging to those values. And as I cling to those values, I am looking around me for new ways to implement them, to support their survival, and to, in a sense, convince others to join me. And for me, this is radical, considering where I come from. But I can understand that there are people much further ahead waiting impatiently for me to join them. And I will say that considering the fact that people were so willing to open their hearts to me and teach me without judgment, I would hope that they would be able to do the same thing, because those are actually the people who are capable of transforming others, not the ones who stand on their pedestals and say, I know I have arrived at the morally correct cause and I disdain anyone who hasn't.
That's all for this week's episode of Mad in Germany. But tune in again next week to hear more about Deborah's life, her views, and get the real scoop on what happened in her court case with the author Mirna Funk. Stay mad.